Good afternoon and to some good morning and a very warm welcome to this year's prediction. Happy to see that so many has called in and joined this year's session. This time again, a huge interest in the presentation of this report, although we obviously have a very different setting this year. My name is Jonas Malmlund. I'm a partner based in Stockholm, Sweden, and also the responsible lead partner for the TMT industry in the Nordics. One thing that is not as different from previous years is that we, as usual, have the author himself, Duncan Stewart, presenting this year's report. Duncan is the director of research for the TMT industry at Deloitte, and it's a pleasure welcoming you again this year, Duncan.
Thanks, Jonas. Great to be there. I miss being at our normal spot on, Grev Turregatan.
That's correct.
That's more fun than me sitting in my kitchen, but maybe next year I hope we'll be able to do this in person again.
Let's hope for that. That will be a pleasure having you here in Stockholm again. Before we start, Duncan, one thing about the questions. We will be able to take questions through the Q&A channel and the chat during the session, and then we will collate them at the end and have a dedicated Q&A session at the end is the setup. So please post your questions in the chat. So, Duncan, without further ado, I leave it to you.
Tack, Jonas. Hey, everybody. Nice to chat to you again. Good to be back virtually in Stockholm and in Sweden. Let me go through a little bit. So I am one of the co-authors, along with our folks in the UK and the US, of the annual 2021 TMT Predictions. Yes, these were heavily influenced by the pandemic. Why do you ask? So there's going to be a lot of talk, obviously, about what we're looking for going forward, not just based on what happened last year, but what we see going forward post-pandemic. And there's all kinds of assumptions in there about economic recovery and pent-up spending and all kinds of fun stuff like that. Yes, of course, Deloitte Sweden will make a copy of these slides available in PDF to anybody who wants. Yes, as Jonas said, there will be questions at the end. And those questions can be not just on the topics that I cover. They can, of course, be on anything that anybody feels like asking me. And I promise to leave a good amount of time for those questions. Let's see, what else do I want to cover? Oh, a couple things. Let's start off. So we actually had, I've got to move the slides forward here. Here we go. We actually had 9 predictions this year, but I think 6 of them are probably most relevant for the market in Sweden and the Nordics. So I'm going to focus on those 6. The other thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to update the predictions as much as possible with the I've been doing this for 3 months now, and I want to update it with as much feedback from clients globally so that you get a sense not just of what Deloitte thinks, but what hundreds, thousands of people and industries and companies around the world are actually seeing in these spaces. Everybody ready? Let's get started. I'm going to start off with video visits to the doctor. What's the prediction? We expect them to rise actually 50-fold, and that number may be low. Why does that matter? Because there's an awful lot of doctor visits around the world. About 8.5 billion doctor visits per year, worth about $500 billion. That's not a typo, $500 billion, and that's the OECD alone. Globally, it would be even larger. 5% of that, as you can see, would be hundreds of millions of video visits and 25 billion in value, but it doesn't stop there. There are a number of pure play telehealth virtual visit solutions. We believe, now these are going to be names out there that you will probably know, like Teladoc and Livongo in the United States, Doctolib and Care in France, and in some relatively exciting news, Amazon announced this morning that they are taking their Amazon Health solution. At first, it was available only to Amazon employees. They've now made it available to anybody who wants to pay them in Washington state, and then probably planning on rolling out nationally. So we predict that market will be at least 8 billion this year, growing at double-digit rates. The other market that's really interesting for technology companies and telecom, I suppose, to some extent, is that if I want to go have a video visit with my doctor, I mean, I can get a lot done face to face. That's great. But there's all kinds of stuff you can't, like blood pressure, blood oxygenation, blood sugar, EEG, EKG. You get the idea, right? I was at CES in Las Vegas, virtually, of course, this January. And some of the hottest products out there were home healthcare, monitoring, therapeutics, diagnostics, FDA approved. These aren't toys. These are real medical devices. That market looks like it's 33 billion or so this year, and it's growing once again at double digits. So keep your eye on that space. It really levers the power of a video call with proper medical technology. Some data points. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but just some of the growth numbers. In the U.S., Medicare primary care visits up 435 times. Veterans Affairs in the States up 12x. Doctolib video consults up 100x. Those are the kinds of numbers we're seeing. As always, I like giving you primary research. This is data from a paper published in 2020 from the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. You might not have heard of that, but it's basically like the Mayo Clinic, but instead of Rochester, Minnesota, it's in Columbus, Ohio. It's one of the top medical facilities in the United States. And as you can see, our numbers here, first week of March, basically pre-pandemic, telehealth was 0.1% of all visits. This is very much the kind of number you tended to see, dominated by in-person. 4 weeks into the pandemic, you can see something going on here. About 20% of visits, so 92% of all visits are now telehealth, of which a majority are phone calls, 71%. Video is only 20%. But 4 weeks later, that flips, right? 70% video and only 22%. And I think I know what was going on there, at least in this one case. If you think about it, I don't know about you, but the first few weeks of the pandemic, by March, 29th, I think I'd done 3 Zoom calls, and I was still pretty nervous about the whole process. And I know a lot about technology, kind of thing. I think the average person at the beginning of the pandemic was still pretty nervous about video calls. But 4 weeks in, by April 26th, we all became Zoom experts, and I think that's what's going on. Now, that's not always the case. In Duke, in the North Carolina, phone continued to dominate. France and Germany, video was heavy. Belgium and the UK, video was light. I don't have the data for Sweden, but around the world, some places are video heavy, some places are telephone heavy, worth keeping in mind. Everybody knows that the pandemic accelerated, catalyzed, if you will, telemedicine, but what happens going forward? My colleagues from Deloitte US actually put out a report on February 18th that asked that exact question. Now, I want you to focus here. This is from 50 of the top clinical leaders in the United States. I want you to focus on the top 2 segments. Chronic condition management and primary care make up 60-70% of all visits in the US. So that's where the dominant number of visits lie. And what you can see here is that at the peak of the pandemic, 45%, nearly half of all visits were in fact virtual. Wow. Okay. Now comes the shocker. We then ask these clinical leaders, what do you expect the optimal level in the future? What do you expect the best number, the right number? What's your prediction going forward? And I would have guessed they'd say 5 or 10%, 34%. Basically, the leading medical experts so we always knew that patients love virtual visits. They are so much faster and more convenient, and I don't need to take transit. I don't need to drive half an hour each way, and I don't need to sit in somebody's waiting room getting sneezed on. Patients love video visits, but doctors and hospitals and clinics love them too. What we see going on is that the medical establishment, the hospitals, the insurers, the governments, and the patients and the doctors are all finding that a video call is a really great screening tool. Instead of just going to the hospital or the doctor or the clinic for the first step, why don't you begin with a video visit? Have a little conversation, and if the doctor solves your problem, great. Maybe some of the time the doctor says, no, you need to come in and get this test. Okay, that's fine. And some of the time the doctor says, you appear to be having a heart attack. Please go to the hospital. In which case, that's what you do. But the idea is virtual visits are something that doctors like and patients like. They're cost effective. They're rapid. They are an efficient screening tool. They will be a large part of the medical journey going forward, both in the US and around the world. Now, we're going to take questions at the end, so don't worry. If you've got a question on virtual visits, type that up and stick it in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get back to it at the end. Next one I want to talk about is the opening up of the radio access network. Now, a lot of people freak out. RAN, what's a RAN? Help, I don't understand. It's complicated. Duncan's talking techno jargon. See this? It's a smartphone. You know what else it is? It's a radio. It's a radio. It is a receiver and a transmitter. And when in order to talk to cell phone towers, it does so over a thing called the RAN, the Radio Access Network. Not complicated. Now, historically, though, Radio Access Network was closed. So here in Canada, my 5G service is coming from a company called Rogers that uses gear from a unnamed company in the telecom space named Ericsson. Oh, oops, I just skipped it. It's Ericsson, okay? So the thing is, if you're Rogers and you buy Ericsson gear, that means you have to have in this area nothing but Ericsson gear. And if you want to get a new radio or a new antenna or new software or a new base station, you need to buy it from Ericsson. You can't just mix and match and go buy from other vendors. These were closed ecosystems, just the same way that data centers used to be closed and the LAN used to be closed and software used to be closed. And I could keep going, right? Computing used to be closed. We've seen all of those things open up over the last 50 years. And when they open up, interesting things happen historically. And I'm not saying that all of this will happen with the traditional RAN, but it's the conversation. Why would anybody move to open versus integrated and proprietary? Because it's more complicated, right? Well, there's sort of a bunch of reasons. More vendors, there tend to be more suppliers. The pace of innovation historically has been higher in open systems versus closed. And not to mention the money factor. Many open systems at first are 10 or 20 or 30% cheaper. And that's a total cost of ownership. But over time, they can actually become much bigger and they can drive prices down even more, 50, 60, 80, 90% in some cases. I'm not saying all that's going to happen at the RAN, but it's worth watching because there is a move right now towards open RAN. Why? Usual reasons, more vendors, greater business agility and innovation, cost savings. There's some stuff going on with tower companies. But probably the biggest one is that we've got greenfield operators with no legacy networks out there building de novo networks. And when you do that, it's really easy to at least consider, maybe I should do open RAN. Another thing that's happening, and you know this in Sweden for sure, is that around the world, governments are forcing people to deinstall, to rip and replace gear from usually Chinese vendors. And when that happens, that's another opportunity. Maybe I should look at open RAN. But there's another one. There's actually a Swedish example I know of in this case, where a telco is building a private 5G network for a client, and it's not across Sweden. It's not the national network. It's not across Denmark. It's not across Israel. It's not across Belgium. It's not across. It is a telco is building a private 5G network for an enterprise, and the enterprise says, "Hey, can we try this open RAN thing?" And the telco goes, "Sure." It's small, it's limited, it's an initial deployment. So that's something that we're certainly seeing. What's the prediction? We're saying the number of open RAN deployments around the world will double this year, 2021, compared to 2020. So that gives you kind of a sense. Now, it's still fairly small. I'll get to some revenue figures in a second. But before I do, this is a Deloitte report that was published, just a few weeks ago. One of the things that we have noticed is that by and large, both in the developing and developed world, only about 20% and only 5% in the developed world of open RAN deployments trials are in urban areas. This is at first being deployed largely in rural markets. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. There's some people out there who believe that these open RANs don't scale well if you've got millions of people in a dense urban environment. That's unclear, although certainly there's some signs that it's maybe not quite ready for that. The other thing is that if I was testing and trialing it, I would rather do it in a remote area where there's, a couple hundred farmers and their cows, rather than in downtown Stockholm where several million people will be upset with me if my open RAN trial doesn't work very well. So I'm not actually surprised to see this kind of shift. So let's talk some numbers in terms of dollars. These are not our numbers. This is from a research firm named Omdia, but nonetheless, the numbers kind of fit within my head, kind of what I would expect. As you can see, 2020, tiny market for open RAN. 2021, first year, $500 million. That's not bad. Growing to $1 billion next year. So 2022 gives you a sense of the kind of growth rate and magnitude. It's still tiny. This is 3-4% of the global market for RAN. Closed RAN continues to dominate for the foreseeable future. Nonetheless, this is a new and interesting and growing area. especially, and I really can't hammer this point enough, I really think it's interesting in those private deployments. That's going to be, I think, a super, super interesting market. One of the things that people need to keep their eye on is Rakuten. Rakuten is a fourth carrier in Japan, encouraged by the government. They have come into that market. They have pushed Open RAN hard. They have acted as their own system integrator. They're trailing a little in terms of number of subs. It's a little slower than they wanted. They also don't have spectrum. They have 20 megahertz of spectrum, or they're supposed to have 20 megahertz of spectrum in their various service areas. Some of them are still only at 5. They're waiting for other people to vacate the spectrum. But in areas where they have the full 20, the service levels have been pretty good. Speeds up, speeds down have been pretty good. And pricing is crazed. I shouldn't say crazed. Pricing is significantly lower than the competitor levels. That 70% is absolutely in line. They are seeing the kind of OPEX, CAPEX savings that we'd seen before, 30-40%. So keep your eye on Rakuten. And then Dish in the US is going to be rolling out. That's going to be sort of now, 2021. And also keep an eye on Jio in India. I was on a webinar in India a couple of weeks ago, and some interesting stuff going on there. They're playing around with Open RAN now, but given that, if anybody here knows Jio, really aggressive on the price level. And of course, in the Indian market, the price of data is super, super low. Fairly obviously, if Open RAN does allow you to drive down cost, that's going to be a big driver. Next topic, let's talk about the cloud. Gee, gosh, is there anything interesting left to say about the cloud? Well, Deloitte predicts that the cloud's going to grow at 30%. Who cares? Well, but why do you say who cares? Well, because it grew at 30% in 2019. Who cares that it's still growing at 30? The important bit isn't that hyperscale cloud revenues grew 30% in 2020. They did. The important bit is that non-cloud shrank by double digits. Okay, I want you to think about that. If something is getting big and the other thing is getting smaller, you end up with this kind of picture. Back in 2019, across all of public cloud, private cloud, and hybrid cloud, about 40% of enterprise workload around the world, this is all workloads, about 40% was in the cloud and about 60% was on-prem, okay? Fast forward to the end of 2021, and that flips. All of a sudden, it looks like about 65% of total workload will now be in the cloud, whereas on-prem has shrunk nearly by half to 35%. This varies by industry and geography, of course, but conceptually, it's more or less right. As Satya Nadella, my apologies, said back in April of 2020, we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. We have some data points to support that kind of rhetoric. Cloud data traffic measured by deep packet inspection is up 100%. Financial performance, cloud companies up basically twice as much as the NASDAQ and gosh, almost 4 times, well, more than 4 times as much as the S&P 500. CapEx numbers are off the charts. Now, want to spend a sec talking about sustainability. Always an important topic, maybe extra important in Sweden. I just co-authored an article actually on cloud sustainability and diversity with Karen Hilson, the CEO of Telenor Sweden. And there's an article out. I'll send you a link if you want, but it's available on the Enterprising Investor website. And we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of sustainability. And it's really important to know that, yes, the cloud uses energy. Yes, that's terrible. Yeah. Okay. First of all, you want to know what uses a lot of carbon is not us having a Zoom webinar for Stockholm. It's flying Duncan to Sweden and back. That uses way, 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 way more carbon by orders of magnitude. So almost always doing something in the cloud is more sustainable than doing it in real life. Next, doing something in the cloud is usually 3 to 4 times more sustainable than doing it on-prem. So that's an advantage. Next, and this one's really important. This is a new slide. I don't think many of my colleagues have seen this. I just put this up, added this to the deck yesterday. This is a thing that looking at, now it would be about the same, I'm sure, for Microsoft and Amazon and all the other big players, Baidu and Alibaba and so forth. What we're looking at here is the PUE, which is the power usage efficiency. As you can see on the right here, PUE is now down to 1.1 on a trailing 12-month average. What does that mean? It means that 90% of the data of the energy that is used in all of Google's large data centers around the world, 90% of it goes to computing. This number 20, 30 years ago in other non-optimized data centers, this number used to be closer to like 30 or 40% of the energy was used for computing. The rest of it used was for heating and cooling and moving air around and uninterruptible power supplies, all of that stuff. The architecture and the chips in the data center have gotten fantastically better over the last 30, 40 years. And even in the last year or two, you can see how Google and the other players continue to chew this number ever. I mean, that number, 90% efficiency, is astonishing. It's just an incredible improvement. Now, a couple of updates I want to give you on the cloud. This is that feedback from client stuff that I'm talking about. So I've talked to a number of enterprises around the world who kind of have told me the following story. So Duncan, we used to be kind of cloud cautious. We did a few things in the cloud, but we were worried about privacy and security and sovereignty and vendor lock-in and pricing and cost and data transmission cost and all that stuff that you've heard about for years. But something funny happened. As a result of the pandemic, we had to move a whole bunch of our operations into the cloud. And at first we were terrified. Oh no, all of our fears about security and everything. And then we kind of got in and we realized, oh, we need to worry about security and sovereignty and all that kind of stuff. But the issues with the cloud that we were afraid, they weren't nearly as bad as we thought. They're there, but as a result, post-pandemic, all that stuff that we did due to the pandemic that we moved in, we're not moving back to on-prem. And the second thing is our roadmap going forward, our cloud journey, our digital transformation continues to stay at this high level. That kind of concept of we were forced into the swimming pool and we discovered that we are enjoying it. And there you go. Okay. Now the second one, bottom right, is a bit confusing to some people. This is the thing where some of the other companies have said, yeah, we moved a bit to the cloud during the pandemic, but not tons. But what happened was something else. Our large enterprise software vendors, our partners, all of our ERP systems, all of our database systems, all of our business intelligence systems, our vendor told us, so you know how you've been buying non-cloud from us and we had a cloud option? Well, we're not going to keep offering the non-cloud option anymore. We are moving to the cloud and you're coming along with us. I call this vendor drag along. And please don't share the slide on the right with any of my friends to mention, I don't know, SAP or Oracle, and have it suggested that they are in fact small white dogs. But I do love that slide. I think it really conveys the idea that there are a number of companies out there that were cloud cautious, but are being pulled along by their vendors. Next topic, and once again, we've got lots and lots of time for Q&A at the end. I want to talk about VR. VR, AR, MR, so that's virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, headsets. Now, I'm not talking about the stuff on your phone. That's different. AR on the phone, totally different market. I'm talking about the headset market. And I want to talk mainly at first about enterprise and education, but then I would like to kind of broaden it and include the consumer. You'll understand why when I get there. So let's start off. You've seen probably slides like this. Digital reality changes everything. Great. Are there any real world examples? Oh yeah, for sure. Multiple industries, multiple applications around the world, Asia, North America, Europe. We're seeing a lot of really cool examples where industry is getting all over this, but training is the elephant in the room. The total VR, AR, MR market, not just headsets, but everything. There's a lot of training in there. I've seen numbers all over the place, but call it 70-ish% is probably not bad. Training is probably for now the killer app in terms of these headsets. As a colleague of mine in the US said, if it's too dangerous, too difficult, or too expensive to train in the real world, why wouldn't you train in a virtual one? So I asked him, what are you thinking about when you say that? He says, well, there's this fire department I know in the States, and they're in a big city. And sometimes they have to think about, train for, prepare for fires in hospitals and on ports and at airports and at oil refineries and chemical plants and nuclear reactors. And you can't go setting nuclear reactors on fire just to practice what it's like to work there. So what they do is they have special training facilities and everybody puts on all their firefighting gear and then they put on VR headsets and they go through kind of like a simulation. And it's much better. And I go, that's awesome. That's so true. That's amazing. I said, what about here at Deloitte when it comes to training our folks on Excel spreadsheets? Do we need? And he was like, no. One, there are absolutely some applications for VR, AR, MR training, which are dangerous, difficult, and expensive. But there's also a lot that aren't. Like, we can all sit together in rooms and look at spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides and stuff like that. So I do want to be a little cautious there. Now, I hope everybody is picking up Duncan's impending sense of caution. I think the VR, AR, MR enterprise market is fascinating. I think it's growing. I'm predicting that sales of headsets this year will double from 2019. Okay, you ready? 200,000 headsets will sell this year. Do you mean 200 million? Nope, 200,000. Just in Sweden? Nope, that's around the world. That's a global number. 200,000, that's not that many. It isn't. The market, the overall market for training and content and services and workflow and all that stuff, that's like $8, $9, $10 billion. It's a much larger market, but the headsets themselves are pretty small. Let me explain why. Now, first of all, headsets are shared devices. So Walmart trained 1 million people. Yay! They did it using 17,000 headsets. That's not very many. Why? The training modules were 5, 10, 15 hours of training per year. So what somebody would do is they would do their training and they'd finish it and then they'd wash off the headset and stick it in the mail and send it to somebody else, right? Each headset was used by, on average, 60 employees. So they are, it doesn't scale one-to-one with employees. In the Netherlands, there was a company that did a field force trial where they used AR headsets for workers in the field, but not for the folks who've been doing the job for 20 or 30 years. They don't need headsets. It was only for new hires and subcontractors. So what's that, 10, 15, 20% of employees? Here in Canada, we did a rollout, province of Saskatchewan, 1.2 million people, and that's 22 headsets. Why? Well, because in the cities with a few 100,000 people, you don't need them. You've got doctors and nurses and clinics and so forth. And then in towns of 10,000 people, you don't need them because that's actually big. In towns of 1,000 people, you did. This was only for like a few villages with a few hundred people in them. So although AR headsets are a great tool for narrowing the digital divide between the big cities and the small villages, there aren't as many people in those small villages as you think. Probably the biggest factor, though, is seen in this bottom point. The most famous deal in the whole XR space is the deal between the US Army and Microsoft. It was for $480 million, so call it $500 million. It's a lot of money, 2,500 headsets. Most of the money went on customization and ruggedization and safety and integrating it with other things and workflow and content and animations. But you get the idea. The headsets themselves are a relatively small part of the market. Now, let's talk about VR headsets, okay? Back in 2019, the number of VR headsets that shipped around the world was about 5.8 million. And I want to share with you a little bit of a science fiction story about Duncan, the future predictions expert at Deloitte, okay? I didn't happen to write a prediction on consumer VR headsets back in March of 2020, but let's play a game and pretend I had, and that I had access to a time machine, okay? So there I am, and I'm like, okay, 5.8 million VR headsets shipped in 2019. It's good industry. It'll probably grow, 15 or 20%. And then I get some news from the time machine. Duncan, in 2020, this pandemic that's looking kind of small in early March, it's actually going to be a much bigger deal than you think. Here's what's going to happen. You know all those people who normally travel to France? They can't travel to France this year. If they want to see the Mona Lisa, the only way they're going to do it is by putting on a VR headset and taking that virtual tour of the Louvre. So I bet a lot of people, if they're stuck at home and can't travel, I bet they're going to buy VR headsets. Ooh, I should take my forecast up. Do you know that there's people locked down in Spain for like 4 weeks and not allowed out of their apartment building? People in little tiny Barcelona apartments, and they've got treadmills and they've got bicycles and rowing machines, and they're bored out of their minds because they're staring at a wall. They're probably going to buy more VR headsets to exercise. Wow, I should take my 2020 number up more. And then frankly, this is the big one, I think. There's going to be literally tens of millions of teenagers. Barbara is just heading out for a run if you're wondering what's zipping behind me there. Okay, and that means I'm now on dog duty. If the dog wants to do anything, I have to pay attention. Anyway, so where was my final point here? Oh yeah, so tens of millions of teenagers are going to be trying to learn from home, not allowed out to the mall, to movies, or to visit their friends, and they are going to be basically bugging mom and dad every 9 minutes while mom and dad are trying to get work done on Zoom calls. Maybe some parents are going to buy their kids VR headsets to basically shut them up and keep them quiet. Says Duncan the futurist. I had better take my numbers up again. My point is, in many, many ways, my dog is visiting me. Hi, Grace. In many, many ways, I think that 2020 and the pandemic, for all the obvious economic and human costs, that the 2020 pandemic in many ways was a perfect storm. This should have dramatically accelerated VR headset shipments. And if I'd had information and been writing a prediction about this back in March, I probably would have predicted the market would have doubled or tripled or quadrupled the way other markets were accelerated by the pandemic. To find out that after essentially the perfect tailwind for VR, that sets actually declined this year is really just a shocking number. My view is, hang on a second, I've got to go let my dog out. Hi, Grace. I'm back. So my takeaway, and not just mine, Ben Evans, a famous technology blogger, great guy, Ben said, and I agree 100%, this should have been a VR moment, and it wasn't. If the global pandemic isn't enough to dramatically accelerate growth in the headset market, it's because outside of the enterprise and education market, people don't like wearing a scuba mask on their face that's painted black and sitting on their sofa. This is just not a consumer thing. People in the enterprise will do it, but that market is fairly small. Next topic, let's talk about women in sports. This is an exciting one. As I said, I wrote that article with Karen Hilson from Telenor and her colleague, her PR colleague who worked on me with the article, Pia Jonsson. She's coach of a girls basketball team. So I thought this was all really, there's some cool stuff going on there. Women's sports is growing. More and more young women and older women are playing sports. They're playing it at high levels. They're playing it professionally. 84% of sports fans watch at least one women's sport. Nearly 100,000 people are watching games live. The FIFA Women's World Cup, amazing numbers. Nearly 1.5 billion people watch the Women's World Cup, TV and online. The final 250 million people. As a matter of fact, the rating for the final in the US for the women's final was higher than for the men's final a couple years earlier. Yet, despite all that, and despite the fact that the global sports market is like nearly $500 billion, that's not a typo, $500 billion, women's sports is under $1 billion. What's our prediction? It's going to reach $1 billion. Why is it going to reach $1 billion? Because people love women's sports. People are watching women's sports. You know this, what's her name? Pernille Hender, I think it is, from Denmark, was transferred from Wolfsburg to Chelsea. Hundreds of thousands of pounds in salary and transfer fees. Lots of momentum there. Let's talk about basketball. Let's talk about basketball for a second. In the US, ESPN pays about $25 million a year for the WNBA, okay? Now, the men's basketball rights are about $2.6 billion, or exactly 104 times larger. Now, I am not saying that more people watched the women's final than the men. Didn't happen. It was smaller. But the men's final, although it was bigger, wasn't 104 times bigger, it was 17 times bigger. And the women's final this year, 2012, last year, 2020, was actually up like 10, 12% over viewing compared to the year before, whereas the men's final was down like 30%. I have this thing out there. I have a television property that costs pennies compared to dollars for men's rights. I have a television property out there that attracts young people, that attracts women, that attracts desirable demographics. It costs little, it's growing, and it's the right audience. This is a market that is poised to take off. I'm going to talk now about the intelligent edge. This is the last of the official predictions, although I've got a little supplementary bonus material here. I want to talk a little bit about the intelligent edge. What is the intelligent edge? I can stick a data center in California and have somebody in Stockholm talking to it, and that's like, what, 10, 15,000 kilometers away. Or I can stick one in the UK. Well, that's still 1,000 kilometers away. I can stick one in Copenhagen. Well, we're getting closer. I can stick one in Stockholm, but maybe there's, Uppsala is far enough away that over and over, what I want to do is I am pushing, for certain kinds of processing, I am pushing the processing closer and closer to the user. We call this the intelligent edge. We predict that the market for this will be $12 billion this year. That's up 100% from where it was in 2019. At first, most of the spending this year is coming from the telecoms and hyperscale cloud providers. So fairly obviously, the cloud folks, the Amazons, Googles, Microsofts, and so forth, they have a tremendous interest in moving processing closer to the user to reduce latency and data transmission costs. So that's a big driver. But they don't have access to, they've got 100 data centers worldwide. They don't have the thousands or tens of thousands of local, what's called points of presence, where you would install these intelligent edge devices. Telecoms companies do have those, and so they're doing it largely together, largely in partnership. Over time, it expands beyond that to manufacturing, industrial, and supply chain. One of the things that's really important about this prediction is that no single provider owns this space yet. You know how Intel and AMD basically have most of the market for chips in the data center. You know how Google controls most of the market for search and that kind of stuff, right? Intelligent edge is one of those kind of greenfield opportunities. Nobody owns it yet. That makes it a really interesting and growing and not yet oligopoly, monopoly market. Why is it so important? One point I will make, it's complementary to the cloud. It is not the cloud still exists. This is only about moving certain costs, certain processes that require either a lot of data transmission, facial recognition, stuff like that. If I can move that closer, I don't need to send those files up over the network. That's a big advantage. The other thing, though, is that it's good for latency. So think about gaming, cloud gaming for sure, video streaming, low latency applications, those are all consumer ones. But stuff like drones examining power lines, mining equipment, robots in factories, real-time diagnostics for predictive failure, lots and lots of financial services, lots and lots of applications there. It's not new. It's decades in the making. One point I will make is, although there are lots of applications, many applications that would benefit from the intelligent edge, there's still a ton of stuff out there that doesn't need it. Like, if I'm doing my overnight database-y kind of stuff, frequently that kind of stuff can be done with, over traditional cloud architecture. You don't need intelligent edge. Are there any real world examples? Absolutely. This is a real one. Port in Asia. I'm also talking to airports. I'm talking to warehouses. Labor costs down by 70, operational efficiency up by 30. This is a real thing. Early days yet, still fairly small market, but it's growing. Want to spend a second talking here about video, just for fun. This is bonus stuff. You may remember that last year, as part of predictions, we spent some time talking not about SVOD, subscription video on demand, but AVOD, ad-supported video on demand. What's going on there? What we have is this is a nice chart. It's not mine, and it's unfortunately lacking a legend. But the pink circles are ad-supported video on demand, AVOD, and the blue circles, like Netflix and Prime and Disney, those are SVOD. Now, everybody pays a lot of attention to SVOD, and we should. It's big and it's important and it's growing. However, I will point out that if you take a look at, the US, the top 6 services, video services, 5 of the top 6 are ad supported. When I look at France, when I look at Germany, 7 of the top 10 are ad supported. When I look at India, 7 of the top 7 are ad supported. This is a thing. Please pay attention to ad supported video on demand. Most of you will notice that number 1 in every single country here is our friends YouTube. So I want to talk a little bit about YouTube. YouTube announced back in 2018 that they had just passed 1 billion hours per day of viewing. Now, that's worldwide, but I do want to hit this point. That's billion hours daily. That's not per year. That's not per week. That's not per month. That's every single day of the year, 365. They haven't updated that number, but I have played around with various sources, and I kind of have jigsaw puzzled it together. As far as I can figure out, about 450 million hours of YouTube is watched every day around the world on TV sets. This is a new thing. Historically, most YouTube viewing was done on computers and smartphones and tablets. But as we see more and more connected TVs, smart TVs, TVs talking to their Apple boxes or Chromecasts or whatever else it is, we are seeing a growing amount of YouTube on the actual big screen TV set. That's a large factor. Now, the traditional market, the smartphone, tablet, computer stuff, that's about 870 million hours a day in 2020. That's in the OECD alone. And when I add in the rest of the world, that's probably another 400 million. Adding that all together, I get a few thoughts. Number one, it comes to 1.7 billion hours per day. That's a lot. That's bigger than the US daily TV market. Now, TV and YouTube is different, but nonetheless, that's a big number. So 1.7 is big. Number two, 1.7 is growing. Based on the growth rates that I'm seeing out there, it looks likely to me that YouTube may crack 2 billion hours this year, 2021. So keep your eyes peeled for an announcement from YouTube that they've gone through too. The next thing I'm going to mention, though, is kind of a funny one. Around the world, the estimates vary. There's somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5 million people connected to the internet. Okay? Call it 4. If there are 4 billion people around the world connected to the internet and YouTube is being viewed for 2 billion hours a day, that means that every woman, man, and child on the planet, on average, who's connected to the internet is watching about half an hour of YouTube per day. I find that a stunning number. Now, I'm not trying to translate that into dollars, and I'm not saying that's bigger than gaming or TV or music or anything else. I'm just making the point that half an hour a day for YouTube is a fairly interesting number. Now, I'm sorry, there may be some background noise. They're doing a renovation on the house beside me, so my apologies if there's I can hear that. I'm not sure if you can. Anyway, for my final slide, before I throw it over to questions. Yeah, we're pretty much on time. For my final slide, I want to talk a little bit about a survey we did in the US. This was back in 2020. We asked people about their streaming video subscriptions. The average American went from 3 to 5 during the pandemic, according to our research. But something interesting is going on there. Back in May of 2020, 23% of people we asked had added a streaming video service, 5% had canceled, and 9% had both added and canceled. Fast forward 5 months, and something interesting happens. The percentage who say that they have canceled goes from 5 to 4, which is not statistically meaningful. The percentage who added a service went from 23 to 20. Once again, not a big difference. However, the percentage who had both added and canceled nearly grew 5 times, from 9% to 34%. And I have a sentence for this. You ready? Churn is the new normal when it comes to media subscriptions. What we are seeing is that people out there have 1 or 2 maybe services that they use, year round, but then they have a list of 5 or 10 or 15 different services where they are choosing, and they watch this one for 2 months and that one for 3 months, and they're constantly taking them on and taking them off. A lot of the implications there for media companies. How do I handle churn? Historically, the view has always been churn is bad and I need to do everything possible to stop it. What if it's different? What if making it easier is actually a better thing? What if I can allow you to pause your subscription? What if I can allow you to move from a paid subscription to a free subscription with ads? What if I can allow you to go into sleep mode kind of idea? Lots of ideas out there, but I do want to close off just quickly with this one. You can see here, this is data that came out just a few weeks ago. As you can see, if I take a look here at March, April timeframe and January, nearly every service out there has higher levels of churn by January 2021 than it did 9 months earlier. So this does appear to be a thing. As always, this is my contact information. I don't have a newsletter. I know everybody and their dog, well, not my dog, has a newsletter, but I don't. I'm too busy. But I do publish stuff on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. If you want to read that article about ESG and diversity in the tech and telecom industries I wrote with Karen Hilson, follow me. I wrote about it yesterday on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. If you want to read my upcoming article about audiobooks and podcasts and radio, you gotta follow me on social media. So I put that up every time. Now I'm going to throw it over. Jonas, do we have any questions from the floor?
We do. And first and foremost, thank you very much, Duncan, for an excellent presentation, as per usual, I should say. We have a few questions. One, we'll start from the top and we go to the last topic. So we take them topic by topic. On
Sure.
telemedicine, do you think that the growth that you're seeing, is it a temporary one or is it a sustainable one? Is it a pandemic effect only, or how much of it is sustainable?
Well, as our Deloitte US survey, I put up a slide on this. At peak, telemedicine was 45% of visits. They expect that going forward, it'll be 34. So to some extent, the peaks we saw during the pandemic will recede a bit. But it going from 45% to 35% is one thing. Going from 45% to 0.4% is another. Largely, most of the gains in telemedicine seen during the pandemic will be retained. I am seeing more and more movement that way, not just from individuals and doctors, but at the level of state medical systems.
Second question on that topic: do we see any kind of widening of the circle, i.e., this moves into to the vet sector or other kind of adjacent areas?
Interesting question. I mean, for some stuff it doesn't work, like dentistry. I can't go to the dentist virtually. Vet is an interesting one. I hadn't thought about that. I haven't seen anything about that. Makes sense to me. Here's my dog, and I think the problem is that getting me or my kid to do a video call is easier than my dog. So I'm going to go. I think that's probably a smaller market. I think it's just tougher.
Let's move on to the open RANs. Assuming successful, what about the capacity? Are there any capacity issues? Are the open RANs capable of hosting a number of operators on their network or service providers on their networks?
We don't know. It's too early to tell. Fairly obviously out there are companies who are big believers in Open RAN, and they are largely doing it in trials and pilots where they are doing larger scales. They don't have that many subscribers yet. We don't yet know if Open RAN will scale. Then again, I'll also tell you that, in the early days of the open data center architecture, people were, that works fine for that, but it won't work at scale. It works perfectly well at scale. I cannot think of any technological reason over the next decade why Open RAN will not scale. That said, it hasn't scaled yet. So it's a legitimate question, and we'll find out more.
And what about the regulatory implications? Are there do we see any regulatory changes that opens up further for the open RANs, or any kind of proceedings on that?
No, there's not a lot of regulatory implications around Open RAN. Basically, regulators have an awful lot to say in terms of things like spectrum and so forth, but that doesn't change whether you're using open or closed. As far as I know, I'm sure there are there's always some regulatory implications, but I haven't seen much so far.
No. Okay. So on the cloud topic, one question we had was, from a technology perspective, what do you see as being the next big thing when it comes to cloud technology? Are there any big advances or changes or technology development that will make it take kind of a next large step?
Not that I can think of. Fairly obviously, the intelligent edge, if you think about it, is kind of related to the cloud. So that's something worth keeping our eye on. Obviously, continued growth in AI is going to be a thing. Probably the biggest thing that we are likely to see in terms of, so there's a lot of stuff out there that's early days and fairly small in the cloud, like use of AI. AI is important in the cloud, but it's still fairly small. It's going to grow. Intelligent edge, fairly small, but it's going to grow. Where I think the biggest, if I can reframe the question, not what's the next big thing, but what's the next important thing, and that's going to be regulation. Around the world, we are going to see that the period between 2010 and 2020 was largely a period of light regulation of technology companies in general, but cloud companies specifically. I would expect to see the next 10 years have significantly higher regulatory burden around things like private. Most of you will be familiar with the EU's Digital Services Act, the DMA. What does the M stand for? Digital Media Act? I can't remember. It's whatever it is, the DSA and the DMA. There's a lot of rules there. I'm going through those right now. In my view, the single biggest deal over the next decade will be regulation.
So on the topic of virtual reality and headsets, one question we had was, will the low number or volume numbers, will that impede the development of the headsets, given that the volume is not there, essentially?
100%. What a great question. And this is the important thing. This is why I keep talking about this. When the smartphone ecosystem developed, there were 1 billion units sold to consumers. That means when enterprises wanted to roll out services on smartphones to their employees on handsets, there was a thriving, profitable, growing, innovative base out there, the economies of scale. When you sell, 4 or 5 million VR headsets per year, it's a much, much smaller base. The ability to innovate, to drive costs down, to get this stuff out there at scale. Yes, at present, VR, AR, and MR headsets are subscale. And there is no sign that either the enterprise or the consumer demand is high enough to push those up to the hundreds of millions of unit level that is where you start seeing the amazing drops in price and acceleration in innovation. So that's a very important point. That's actually almost a key point in the VR, AR, MR world. As long as it stays at, at 5 million, 10 million units a year, it's hard for them to really get that kind of exponential takeoff. Great question.
Good. So moving on to the intelligent edge area, in what industries do you see the edge computing, intelligent edge developing the fastest, and maybe again back to being most important or significant in terms of development?
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, the telcos and the cloud people are doing it first, but that's sort of, they are providing it to industries. Which industries are buying the intelligent edge? Video and gaming, absolutely way up there on the consumer side. Factories, robotics, roboticization, mining, utilities, ports, logistics, airports. Those are the ones where I see it moving first. Retail, less so. Retail doesn't need that kind of real-time latency, generally. Although that could change. I mean, one of the things we talk about, Jonas, we haven't mentioned this, but remember I said, when I'm talking about AR, I'm talking about the headsets. I'm not talking about the phone. When we take a look at AR, augmented reality, on the phone, there's a lot of interesting retail application stuff where I can go into a store and, I can use this like a virtual mirror and I can say, how do I look in this shirt or this tie or that hat? And I can superimpose that. That kind of thing might actually require some intelligent edge processing, to move that closer. Now, that's not a big part of retail yet, but it could be. So it could be. Financial services, it's a mix. There will be some applications where you need it, some where you don't. But no, I think it's manufacturing, ports, logistics, supply chain, and utilities. Utilities are big users as well.
So moving to maybe the final question here on the media subscriptions. Oh, yeah. What do you see? I guess that's the number one question. Do you see future players being further future players, or do you see consolidation in terms of the media players?
I saw a stat. Jonas, it can't be true. I saw a stat that there's 700 different SVOD services available in the US. 700? That can't be right. At some point, we're going to see consolidation. Even now, I think some of those are obviously going to have a lot of trouble finding enough customers to support themselves. However, at the level of right now, whether it's 700 or 500, that's more than any human being could possibly use. So I believe we will see some consolidation. But will we see consolidation at the large players who have tens of millions of subs getting together so that consumers can do a one-stop shopping, where maybe I have 2 services rather than having 15 that I choose between? I do not see that for the next 2 or 3 years. I believe that in the short term, There's a lot of people out there, and they're looking for subscribers, and they're looking for eyeballs for AVOD. And I believe that there will be continued high levels of big numbers of subscription media offerings. I believe that 5 to 10 years out, they start consolidating, but down to a more manageable, shorter list. But I think in the near term, I think it's going to be like, when you walk into the restaurant, I always use the one. What's that one? The Tour d'Argent in Paris. Wonderful restaurant, great food, amazing view, high prices, massive wine list. It's about yay thick. It's actually frightening because it's got like 5,000 wines or something on it, and it's going to be like that. The video streaming business, the media subscription business, is going to have almost too many choices for the next few years. After that, it changes.
Good. I think we're at the top of the hour. So, Duncan, many thanks for this year's presentation. And for next year, then hopefully seeing you back again in Stockholm live.
Tak. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being there. And do follow up with questions if you have them via email.
Thank you very much, and see you next time around.